The photograph shows a woman in her 70s, smiling gently at the camera. She looks like someone's grandmother, the kind who bakes cookies and tells stories about the old days. But if you look closer at her eyes, you see something else, something harder, something that has seen things no grandmother should ever see. Her name was Nancy Wake, and by the time she was 30 years old, she was the most decorated servicewoman of World War II and the Gestapo's most wanted person, with a 5 million franc bounty on her head. They called her the White Mouse because no matter how many traps they set, no matter how many times they cornered her, she always slipped away. This is not a story about war. This is a story about what happens when an ordinary person decides that evil will not win. Not today. Not ever. August 1912. A baby girl was born in Wellington, New Zealand. Her father was a journalist who drank too much and cared too little. Her mother was a stern woman who believed children should be seen and not heard, that girls should be quiet, obedient, and prepared for nothing more than marriage and motherhood. Nancy Wake was none of those things. She grew up as the youngest of 6 children in a household that had more arguments than meals. Her father eventually abandoned the family, leaving her mother to raise 6 kids on almost nothing. They moved to Sydney, Australia, where poverty wasn't just a condition, it was a cage. Nancy watched her mother work herself to exhaustion. She watched her older siblings accept their circumstances, bow their heads, and settle for whatever scraps life threw at them. Nancy decided very early that she would rather die than live like that. She was wild, rebellious, and completely unmanageable. She got into fights with boys twice her size and usually won. She refused to wear the dresses her mother laid out. She climbed trees, stole apples from neighbors' orchards, and told her teachers exactly what she thought of their boring lessons. Her mother didn't know what to do with her. Neither did anyone else. When she was 16, an aunt died and left Nancy a small inheritance, about 200 pounds. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. Nancy saw her chance. She packed a single suitcase, left a note on the kitchen table, and walked out the door. She didn't ask permission. She didn't apologize. She just left. She worked as a nurse in Sydney for 3 years, saving every penny she earned. She lived in a tiny room, ate 1 meal a day, and put everything else aside. She had a plan. She was going to see the world. She was going to live a life that mattered, and nobody was going to stop her. In 1932, at 20 years old, Nancy bought a ticket to New York. From there, she traveled to London, and then to Paris. It was the early 1930s. Europe was glamorous, sophisticated, and completely intoxicating. Paris had jazz clubs, artists, writers, and a freedom she had never experienced in Sydney. Nancy found work as a freelance journalist. She wasn't covering fashion shows or society parties. She was drawn to the darker stories, the political tensions bubbling under the surface of European society. She could sense something was wrong. The economy was collapsing. Radical political movements were rising. There was anger in the streets, a hunger for someone to blame. And in Germany, a man with a mustache and a voice like a thunderstorm was giving people exactly what they wanted to hear. In 1933, Nancy traveled to Vienna on assignment. She was there to write about the Austrian political situation. What she saw there didn't just change her perspective, it changed her soul. Nancy watched as Nazi brownshirts dragged Jewish men and women into the streets. She watched them force elderly rabbis to scrub pavements with toothbrushes while crowds laughed and jeered. She saw a soldier beat a man unconscious simply because he looked Jewish, because his nose was the wrong shape, because he existed. She stood there, her reporter's notebook shaking in her hands, watching human beings being treated like animals. And she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would fight these people, whatever it took, however long it lasted. She would fight them until they were destroyed or she was dead. But first, she fell in love. His name was Henri Fiocca. She met him at a party in Marseille in 1936. He was a wealthy French industrialist, charming, sophisticated, and completely devoted to Nancy from the moment he saw her. He didn't care that she was a foreign journalist with no family connections. He didn't care that she had a sharp tongue and a habit of speaking her mind. He loved her exactly as she was. They married in 1939. Nancy had everything she had ever wanted: a beautiful apartment overlooking the old port of Marseille, a husband who adored her, enough money to never worry again. She threw parties that lasted until dawn. She wore designer dresses. She drove a convertible through the French countryside. She had escaped poverty, escaped her mother's disappointment, and built herself a life of comfort and joy. She could have sat out the war in luxury, but Nancy Wake had never taken the easy path in her entire life. She wasn't about to start now. May 1940, the German army invaded France. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. The French military, which everyone believed was the finest in Europe, collapsed in 6 weeks. The government fled to Vichy. The Nazis marched down the Champs-Élysées, their boots echoing on the cobblestones, their flags hanging from the Arc de Triomphe. France was cut in half. The north was occupied by German forces. The south became Vichy France, a puppet government that collaborated with the Nazis, that rounded up Jews, that arrested resistance fighters, that pretended sovereignty while taking orders from Berlin. Nancy and Harry were in Marseille, in the unoccupied zone. Technically, they were safe. The Germans weren't there yet. Nancy could have kept her head down, played the role of the society wife, and waited for the war to end. Instead, she turned her apartment into a resistance headquarters. It started with a knock on the door late one night. A friend of a friend knew someone who knew someone. There was a British pilot. His plane had been shot down. He was hiding in a barn outside the city. The Vichy police were searching for him. If they found him, he would be handed over to the Germans. Could Nancy help? Nancy didn't hesitate. She took the pilot in, hid him in her guest room, fed him, and gave him civilian clothes. Then she started asking questions. How many more pilots were out there? How many escaped prisoners of war? How many Jews fleeing the roundups in Paris? The answer was hundreds, maybe thousands. They were hiding in barns and forests and cellars, terrified and starving. They needed help. They needed a way out. Nancy decided she would give them one. She began building a network. She recruited truck drivers to smuggle people in cargo holds covered with vegetables or furniture. She bribed police officers to look the other way at checkpoints. She learned to forge documents, identity papers that looked so authentic, even German officers couldn't tell they were fake. She personally escorted dozens of Allied soldiers through hundreds of miles of occupied France, over the Pyrenees Mountains, into Spain. The Pyrenees crossing was brutal. The mountains were steep, freezing, and patrolled by both German soldiers and Spanish border guards. People died on those trails. They fell from cliffs. They froze to death. They were shot by patrols. Nancy made the crossing multiple times, leading groups of men who could barely walk, keeping them quiet, keeping them moving, because stopping meant death. She was 28 years old. She had no military training. She had never fired a gun, but she had something more valuable than training. She had audacity. She had the ability to look a German soldier in the eye and lie with such confidence that he believed every word. She had the ability to stay calm when everything was falling apart. And she was good at it. Really good. By 1943, Nancy had personally helped over 1,000 people escape occupied France. The escape route she created became known as the Pat Line, after a Belgian officer named Patrick O'Leary, who helped organize it. But Nancy was the engine that kept it running. She was the one who bribed the guards, forged the papers, and walked the terrified refugees across the mountains. The Gestapo knew someone was running an escape route through Marseille. They knew someone was making fools of them, helping enemies of the Reich slip through their fingers. So they sent in Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, one of the most sadistic men in the entire SS. He had a reputation for creativity and torture. He didn't just break bodies, he broke minds. People who survived his interrogations were never the same. He was tasked with one mission: find the white mouse and kill her. Nancy didn't know she had a code name yet. She didn't know there was a 5 million franc bounty on her head, enough money to buy a mansion, enough money to make her the most wanted person in France. She just kept working. One more pilot, one more family, one more trip to the Spanish border. Then one night in 1943, everything fell apart. Nancy came home to find her street blocked off. Black Citroën cars with Gestapo flags, armed men in leather coats, spotlights. Her apartment building was surrounded. Harry had been arrested. They were waiting for her. Nancy didn't panic. She walked past her own building, her heart hammering, her hands steady. She kept walking. She didn't look back. She went to a safe house, grabbed an emergency bag she always kept packed with money, false papers, and a change of clothes, and disappeared into the night. She never saw Henri again. The Gestapo interrogated Henri for weeks. They tortured him in the basement of their headquarters. They broke his fingers. They pulled out his teeth. They did things that left him screaming. They wanted one thing: where is your wife? Where is Nancy? Henri told them nothing. Not a name, not a location, not a single word. He died protecting her. He died knowing she was still out there, still fighting, still free. When Nancy found out months later, after she had escaped France, she locked herself in a room and cried for 3 days. Then she dried her tears, straightened her shoulders, and got back to work. Grief was a luxury for peacetime. She had work to do, and now it was personal. Now she wasn't just fighting for the pilots and the refugees, she was fighting for Henri. She was fighting for revenge. Nancy decided that hiding wasn't enough anymore. She needed to join the real fight. She needed training, weapons, and support. She needed to get to Britain. But the escape routes she had helped create were compromised. The Gestapo was watching everything, every port, every border, every safe house. So Nancy attempted one of the most dangerous journeys of the war. She would cross the Pyrenees Mountains in winter, on foot, through snow and ice, with Gestapo patrols actively hunting her. The Pyrenees in winter are a death trap. Professional climbers with proper equipment have died on those slopes. Nancy crossed them in a dress and heels, because that's all she had. The guide she hired abandoned her halfway up the mountain, terrified of being caught. Nancy kept going alone. She climbed in darkness. She slept in caves. She ate snow when she ran out of water. She made it to Spain. From there she traveled to Gibraltar, then finally to Britain. She walked into the office of the Special Operations Executive, the SOE, Britain's secret sabotage organization, Churchill's Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. She was exhausted, filthy, and furious. She told them she wanted to go back to France. She wanted to kill Nazis. The recruiting officer looked at this 31-year-old woman, this socialite from Marseille with her Parisian accent and her expensive clothes, and he almost laughed. The SOE was an organization of hardened soldiers, assassins, and saboteurs. What could this woman possibly contribute? Then they ran her background check. They saw the escape routes. They saw the forged papers. They saw the 5 million franc bounty. They saw that Klaus Barbie himself had been assigned to hunt her. They stopped laughing. They sent her to Scotland for training. The SOE training program was designed to break people. Parachute jumps, hand-to-hand combat, weapons training, explosives, silent killing techniques, interrogation resistance. They would wake recruits at 3 a.m. with blank rounds fired over their heads to simulate stress. They would drop them in the wilderness with nothing but a knife and tell them to survive for a week. They would torture them in mock interrogations to prepare them for the real thing. Nancy threw herself into every exercise with ferocious intensity. The male commandos complained about the physical demands. Nancy did twice the training load and asked for more. She learned to fire a Sten gun, a British submachine gun that was cheap, ugly, and brutally effective. She learned to assemble it and disassemble it blindfolded. She learned to kill silently with her hands, with wire, with whatever was available. Her instructors noted that she was one of the most naturally gifted fighters they had ever seen. She had no fear of parachuting. She could land in complete darkness and know exactly where she was. She could lie convincingly under interrogation. And she had something most male soldiers didn't have. She could blend in. A woman traveling alone didn't raise suspicion the way a man did. She could flirt with German soldiers at checkpoints, make them laugh, and be waved through without a search. In April 1944, just 2 months before D-Day, Nancy Wake parachuted back into France. But this wasn't the France she had left. This was occupied France, where collaborators informed on their neighbors, where children were taught to report their parents, where the penalty for helping the resistance was death by torture in the basement of a Gestapo headquarters. Nancy landed in the Auvergne region, a mountainous area in central France. The region was remote, heavily forested, and full of caves, perfect for guerrilla warfare. Her mission was to link up with the Maquis, the rural resistance fighters, and prepare them for D-Day. The invasion was coming. The French resistance needed to be ready to sabotage German communications, railways, and supply lines. When the Allies landed, the resistance would strike behind enemy lines and turn the German rear into chaos. Nancy was dropped with 3 male agents. They were all experienced soldiers, veterans of special operations. Nancy was the only woman, and she was put in command. Some of the men didn't like that. They didn't like taking orders from a woman. They didn't like it for about 24 hours. Then they saw her work, and they shut up. The local Maquis numbered about 3,000 fighters. They were brave, passionate, and completely disorganized. They had hunting rifles and makeshift explosives. They had no military training, no communication equipment, and almost no weapons. Most of them were young men who had fled forced labor conscription, farmers who were tired of German soldiers stealing their food, and idealists who believed France should be free. Nancy's job was to turn this group of farmers and students into an army. She did it in 3 months. Nancy cycled hundreds of miles across occupied France, setting up supply drops, coordinating between different resistance groups, and personally training fighters in guerrilla tactics. The bicycle became her signature. She could cover massive distances without needing gasoline, which was heavily rationed and monitored. She could take back roads and trails that vehicles couldn't use. And a woman on a bicycle looked harmless. She negotiated with feuding resistance leaders who hated each other almost as much as they hated the Germans. Communists who wanted revolution, nationalists who wanted France restored, former soldiers who wanted military discipline, criminals who wanted to settle old scores. Nancy somehow got them all to work together. She didn't do it with speeches. She did it by being tougher than all of them. The British started airdropping supplies. Weapons, explosives, ammunition, radios, medical supplies. Nancy organized the drops. She would find a suitable field, arrange for lookouts, light signal fires, and coordinate the timing. The planes would come in the middle of the night, flying low to avoid German radar. They would drop containers by parachute. Nancy's teams would grab the containers, hide the parachutes, and disappear before German patrols arrived. Then she distributed the weapons and taught the fighters how to use them. She trained them in ambush tactics, how to attack a convoy and disappear before reinforcements arrived, how to sabotage a railway line so the damage looked like an accident, how to assassinate a collaborator and make it look like a robbery. She led raids on German installations. She personally destroyed the Gestapo headquarters in Montluçon, a coordinated attack that killed dozens of Gestapo agents and destroyed their files. She ambushed German convoys. She blew up bridges, railway lines, and communication centers. The Germans knew the White Mouse was back. They threw everything at her. They sent entire battalions to hunt her down. They tortured captured resistance fighters for information. They executed civilians suspected of helping her. The bounty on her head increased again and again. They wanted her dead more than almost anyone else in France. Nancy kept moving. She never slept in the same place twice. She changed her appearance constantly. One day she was a peasant woman selling cheese at a market, her face weathered, her clothes shabby. The next day she was a wealthy widow traveling to visit family, elegant and imperious. She spoke French with multiple regional accents. She could disappear into a crowd like smoke. But her most legendary moment, the story that would define her legacy, came during a supply crisis. The resistance was running desperately low on ammunition and explosives. A major operation was planned, an attack on a German ammunition depot. Without explosives, the attack would fail. A supply drop had been scheduled, but the radio operator had been killed in a German raid. Without radio contact, the British wouldn't send the drop. Without the supplies, the resistance couldn't continue operations. The entire network was grinding to a halt. Nancy needed to get a message to Britain. The nearest working radio was with another resistance group over 200 miles away, through German-controlled territory, over mountains, with Gestapo checkpoints every few miles. A vehicle would take days and would likely be stopped and searched. Walking would take weeks. They didn't have weeks. Nancy did it on a bicycle. She left at dawn and cycled for 3 days straight, 200 miles through occupied France. She dodged German patrols. She bluffed her way through checkpoints, flirting with soldiers, showing forged papers, acting like she had every right to be there. She hid in barns when the patrols came too close. She slept for 2 hours in a ditch. She ate whatever she could find. Her route took her through mountains. She cycled uphill for hours, her legs burning, her lungs screaming. Then downhill, the bicycle rattling, barely in control. She crossed rivers on damaged bridges. She navigated by memory and intuition because she couldn't risk carrying a map. She reached the radio operator, sent the message, got confirmation from London that the supply drop was rescheduled, then she got back on the bicycle and rode back, another 200 miles. By the time she returned, her hands were bleeding from gripping the handlebars. Her feet were so swollen she couldn't get her shoes off. She had lost 10 pounds in 3 days. But the supplies were dropped 2 days later. The resistance operations continued. The attack on the ammunition depot was successful, and Nancy Wake became a legend. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The invasion began. Nancy's resistance forces went into overdrive. They cut telephone lines, paralyzing German communications. They destroyed railway tracks, preventing reinforcements from reaching Normandy. They ambushed convoys, killing German soldiers and destroying equipment. They created chaos behind enemy lines, forcing the Germans to divert troops to protect their rear instead of fighting on the beaches. In one engagement, Nancy's group was ambushed by a German patrol. It turned into a close-quarters firefight. Nancy saw one of her men struggling with an SS officer. The man was losing. Nancy didn't have time to reload her weapon. She didn't have a knife within reach. She used her hands. She killed the SS officer with a judo chop to the throat, a technique she had learned in Scotland. The man collapsed, choking. Nancy didn't wait to see if he survived. She grabbed her fighter and pulled him to cover. After the war, journalists asked her about killing. They expected remorse, trauma, nightmares. Nancy looked at them like they were idiots. "In a war, you kill or be killed," she said. "I killed him with my bare hands because I had to. He was trying to kill my friend. What was I supposed to do? Ask him nicely to stop?" By August 1944, France was liberated. Nancy Wake had helped coordinate over 7,000 resistance fighters. Her forces had killed over 1,500 German soldiers and destroyed multiple infrastructure targets critical to the German war effort. She had cycled hundreds of miles, fought in dozens of battles, survived assassination attempts, and never been captured. When Paris was liberated, Nancy walked into the city wearing her British SOE uniform. She went to the Ritz Hotel, the most famous hotel in Paris, a place where German officers had stayed during the occupation. She sat at the bar and ordered champagne. The bartender, who had worked there before the war and had served her in the old days, simply smiled and said, "Welcome back, Madame Wake." After the war, the medals poured in. Britain gave her the George Medal, one of the highest civilian honors. France gave her the Croix de Guerre 3 times, along with the Médaille de la Résistance. The United States gave her the Medal of Freedom. She became the most decorated servicewoman of World War II, more medals than most generals, more honors than most soldiers who served for decades. But Nancy didn't care about the medals. She went looking for Henry. She traveled back to Marseille, to their apartment overlooking the port. She climbed the stairs, her heart pounding, hoping somehow, impossibly, that he had survived, that the reports were wrong, that he was waiting for her. The apartment was empty, looted. Everything they had owned was gone. She found his death certificate at the city records office. Executed by the Gestapo, October 1943, 2 years ago. Nancy stood in the empty apartment and let herself cry. She cried for Henry. She cried for the life they should have had. She cried for all the people she couldn't save. Then she packed his photograph, the only thing she had left of him, and walked away. Nancy never remarried. She said Henry was the only man she ever loved. She kept his photograph on her bedside table for the rest of her life, 68 years. As for Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, the man who had tortured Henry, the man who had been sent to kill her, he escaped to South America after the war, protected by CIA connections. It took 40 years, but he was finally captured in 1983, extradited to France, tried for crimes against humanity, and sentenced to life in prison. Nancy didn't attend the trial. When asked why not, she said she had more important things to do than watch an old man cry. Nancy moved to Australia after the war. She tried to live a quiet life, but quiet didn't suit her. She was bored, restless. She had gone from coordinating armies and blowing up Nazi headquarters to grocery shopping and doing laundry. It was unbearable. She ran for political office and lost. She worked as a saleswoman. She drank whiskey, smoked cigarettes, played cards, and told wild stories that nobody quite believed. In her later years, journalists would track her down and ask about the war. They expected a frail old woman, haunted by memories, traumatized by violence. Instead, they found a tough, funny, unapologetic woman who would light a cigarette, pour a drink, and tell them exactly what she did to the Nazis who got in her way. She didn't soften the stories, she didn't apologize, she didn't pretend war was noble or clean. She was asked once if she had any regrets about the violence, about the men she killed. Nancy looked at the interviewer like they were stupid. "Not even a bit," she said. "I killed a lot of Germans, and I am glad I did. They deserved it. I couldn't care less. They were the enemy, and they started it. I'd do it tomorrow again." She was asked if she considered herself a hero. "Don't be ridiculous," she said. "I wasn't a hero. I was just doing my job. Anyone would have done the same." But that's the thing, not anyone would have. Most people, faced with the Nazi war machine, faced with the Gestapo, faced with torture and execution, would have hidden, would have collaborated, would have fled. Nancy strapped on explosives, grabbed a bicycle, and rode straight into the heart of darkness. She didn't do it for medals. She didn't do it for glory. She did it because someone had to, and she refused to wait for someone else. Nancy died in 2011 in a London nursing home. She was 98 years old. She had outlived the Third Reich by 66 years. She died peacefully, which is more than can be said for most of the men who tried to kill her. Her ashes were scattered in the mountains of the Auvergne region, the French countryside she had fought to liberate, the fields where she had received supply drops, the forests where she had hidden from patrols. The French military sent an honor guard. Veterans stood in the rain and saluted. At her funeral, a French general gave the eulogy. He said, "Nancy Wake was the most feminine woman I knew until the fighting started, and then she became the most dangerous soldier on the battlefield." When she was 90, a reporter asked Nancy what she wanted to be remembered for. She thought for a moment and then smiled that dangerous smile and said, "I hope people remember that I never gave up, that I fought until the very end, and that I killed a lot of Nazis." So when someone tells you that one person cannot make a difference, when they say the enemy is too powerful, the odds too long, the system too corrupt, remember the woman on the bicycle. Remember the white mouse who made the Third Reich look like fools, who turned a network of farmers into an army, who cycled 200 miles to send a message because that's what needed to be done. Remember that courage doesn't wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears a dress and heels, and crosses mountains in winter because evil doesn't get to win. Remember that the greatest weapon against tyranny isn't firepower or strategy. It's the refusal to surrender, the refusal to be quiet, the refusal to accept that darkness gets the final word. Nancy Wake stared down the most powerful military machine in human history, the machine that conquered most of Europe, that murdered millions, that seemed unstoppable. And she said, "Not today." And then she made sure tomorrow never came for them either. This was the story of Nancy Wake, the woman who wouldn't quit, the soldier who wouldn't surrender, the white mouse who proved that sometimes the smallest creature in the room is the deadliest, the woman who fought because she was terrified and did it anyway, the woman who loved deeply, lost everything, and kept fighting because that's what heroes do. If you believe courage deserves to be remembered, then share it. Tell someone. Post it. Talk about it. Because history is full of forgotten warriors, men and women who stood against darkness when everyone else looked away. They're waiting for someone to speak their names, to tell their stories, to remind the world that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they refuse to accept evil. We're going to tell their stories, every single one, because the world needs to remember that heroes aren't born, they're made. They're made in the moment when fear says run and they say no. They're made when the odds are impossible and they fight anyway. They're made when everything is lost and they keep going. Nancy Wake was one of those heroes, and her story, like so many others, deserves to be told.